ago, I think, to preach. And it was quite surprising to me as I looked at the lectionary for today that the message was still the same, or very similar. It was forgiveness. So I couldn't do that 2 sermons in a row. So you're not going to hear about forgiveness, but one of the things to note is how often forgiveness is in fact the theme of the gospel. The book of Exodus is the story of the Hebrew people's escape from their slavery in Egypt, their 40 years of wandering in the wilderness, and their eventual arrival in the Promised Land. The parting of the Red Sea begins their exodus from Egypt, and as you heard the setup this morning in the scripture reading read by Hal, the Hebrew people were fleeing for their lives from an angry Pharaoh, and they arrived at the edge of the Red Sea. We've all heard the saying, trapped between the devil and the deep blue sea, but in this case, according to the story, the Hebrews were trapped between the Egyptian army and the deep Red Sea. Then Moses stretched out his hand over the sea. But God drove the sea back with a strong wind and turned the sea into dry land, and the waters were divided. The Israelites went into the sea on dry ground, the waters forming walls on their left and on their right. Now the Egyptians pursued and went into the sea after them, all of the Pharaoh's horses and chariots and chariot drivers. At that morning watch, the Lord of the pillar of fire and cloud looked down on the Egyptian army and threw the Egyptian army into a panic. He clogged their chariot wheels so that they turned with difficulty. And the Egyptians said, "Let us flee from the Israelites, for the Lord is fighting for them against Egypt." Then the God said to Moses, "Stretch out your hand over the sea, so that the water may come back upon the Egyptians, upon their chariots, and upon the drivers." So Moses stretched out his hands over the sea, and the sea returned to its normal depth. The Egyptians were all lost. They were all lost at sea. The waters returned and covered the chariots and the chariot drivers and the entire army. None were to remain. But the Israelites had walked on dry ground through that sea, with the waters on both sides. Thus God saved Israel that day from the Egyptians. Israel saw the great work of God against the Egyptians, and so therefore the Israelites feared the Lord and believed in God and believed in Moses. So, what do you make of a story like this? You can think of all the possible approaches. I mean, there's more questions that come to my mind because of this story, such as, did God love the Egyptians? Or did the Egyptians have faith in God? And what happened to all those people left behind in Egypt? How did that nation rise? Did they matter to God? Did this miracle really happen? Did God defy the laws of the natural world to deliver the Israelites from the bondage in Egypt? Or is this story simply a myth, written by the Hebrews several hundred years after it supposedly happened, at the time when the greatest enemy of Israel was the nation of Egypt? But considering that right before they attempted the escape from Egypt, the Hebrew God, as we heard last week, passed over and killed the nation's firstborn sons, Egyptians had a pretty good reason for chasing the Israelites. And next week, we'll hear that the Israelites were a bit ungrateful to both God and Moses, considering that almost immediately after the parting of the sea, they got angry with Moses and said, "If only we had died by the hand of the Lord in the land of Egypt, when we sat by the fledshed and ate our full of bread. For you have brought us out into the wilderness, and you'll kill us with hunger." I've always thought that this episode would make a great comedy skit. Here are all these enslaved people who have just been delivered from slavery, and in the process witness a miracle beyond the scope of human imagination. And almost instantly, they turn to Moses and say, "We're hungry." "Thanks a bunch, Moses. We weren't hungry in Egypt." Well, this passage generates lots of questions. And there's probably more than 2 sermons here. But today, I want to take a look and talk about the story. I suspect you've heard sermons on this passage before, and I don't know that I can bring any new and fresh insight to this story that would make you walk out of it this morning and say, "Oh yeah, I get it now. Now this story makes perfect sense to me." So the slice I want to take it this morning is, why did this story about the Red Sea survive through the ages? Think about it. This story comes literally from prehistoric times. To me, this is intriguing. Over some outrageously long period of time, our minds evolved to the point that our grunts turned into language, and we were able to communicate with one another. And that is surely when everything started to change for humanity. Once our ancestors were able to take the things that they were thinking and convey them to others, that's when life changed. Language is surely one of the things that make human beings different from other forms of being. I wonder what the first story ever told was. It was probably true, and it probably involved a family and an adventure. Perhaps it was some ancient mother telling her young child about the way his grandfather used to hunt, or to laugh, or to fight. And that story would have been passed along generation to generation, long before we had developed the ability to chronicle history in the written word. There must have been millions of stories, some true, some made up, that were told and retold. Jim, my husband, has taught me that you don't let the facts get in the way of a good story. He's a great storyteller, and he reminds me every time that I suggest a point of clarification, because he has the wrong date or he has the wrong people in the story, and it didn't quite happen that way. He says, don't let the facts get in the way of my story. But each culture has stories that are not forgotten. What is it about these stories that survive through the ages? There are certain stories that contain such power, they seem to be almost an inherent part of the human imagination, such as the creation stories, and various myths about the first man and the first woman, and the flood stories. In culture to culture, these stories originated and survived with amazing similarities. So today's story, the story of the parting of the Red Sea, is not as ancient as those, but is still a story that has managed to be told from generation to generation for hundreds and hundreds of years, until at last it's been written down and we have it in our Bible. Now, well, after 3,000 years after the story is said to have taken place, it took place on the other side of the world, you'd be hard-pressed to find a single person in this community that's not familiar with that story. There's something about a good story, and this one is obviously a doozy. We can say it's because it's in the Bible and we know it, but there are countless stories that are in the Bible that have not rooted themselves as firmly in the human imagination as the story of the parting of the Red Sea. Why this story? I wonder it's because this story, like all good stories, speaks a truth to us that resonates deep within. Before we even realize it's happening, the story is making the synapses in our brain crackle with energy. Even as the sound is vibrating in our eardrums, we are certain that deep within our soul, there are harmonies that are just below our level of consciousness that are whispering something like it's something special here, something true. Now, I don't know how to explain why certain stories stand the test of time and survive through countless generations. Most stories simply vanish. So what is the truth in this story that speaks to us? It seems to me, for a story to be a real survivor, it must speak truth directly to the human predicament. There has to be something about the story that resonates with almost everyone. There has to be something about the story that's meaningful to a person born 1,000 years ago in an igloo on the Arctic Circle, and is meaningful to somebody in Botswana as it is to somebody born here in Hanover, Massachusetts. What is the truth that we hear in the story?